The glass wall of the boardroom felt like the edge of a cliff. Below, the city sprawled in a grid of endless lights, a vast machine that had demanded her patience for years. Every window was a reminder of the scale she had been told was not for her. Keep your voice low. Stay realistic. Wait for your turn. The words had been a steady diet of restraint, feeding a silence that had lasted far too long. Maya pressed her palm against the cold surface, watching the reflection of the room behind her. It was a space designed for order, for the preservation of a status quo she had spent a decade upholding. The silence in the room was not empty. It was heavy, saturated with the unspoken expectations of those who sat at the long table. They saw her as a fixture, a permanent support in their established narrative. She watched the way the light caught the dust motes in the air, suspended and still. She had been just like them, frozen in place, waiting for permission that would never come. Her reflection stared back, composed and still, but the pulse in her throat told a different story. She pushed off the glass. It was time to stop watching the city and start forcing it to watch her. She turned from the glass, the city lights fading into a blur behind her. Her hands found the leather portfolio resting on the mahogany surface. She gripped it, her fingers locking down until the knuckles turned stark white against the dark material. The grain of the leather bit into her skin, a sharp, grounding sensation that cut through the haze of hesitation. Somewhere, the ventilation system hummed, a low and rhythmic drone that had filled these rooms for years, dictating the pace of every conversation. She felt the weight of the years she had spent absorbing the rules of this space. The compliance she had practiced was not a choice. It was a habit etched into her movements. But the grip on the portfolio refused to loosen. Every muscle in her forearm tightened, mirroring the pressure building behind her ribs. She looked down at her hands, observing the trembling in her thumb, and pressed harder, forcing the shaking to stop. The room smelled of stale coffee and expensive paper, the scent of a stagnant career. She inhaled deeply, drawing the air into her lungs as if it were fuel. Ventive was no longer a burden, it was a weapon. She stood there, anchored by the pressure of her own hand, waiting for the exact moment the room would realize the game had changed. The distance between the wall and the head of the table was only 12 feet, but it felt like a canyon. To her left sat the sidelines, the comfortable, cushioned chairs where she had spent years observing, nodding, and keeping her voice at a whisper. It was a space of safety, a place where no one would challenge her and no one would truly see her. She looked at the polished wood of the table, then toward the empty chair at the center. The air in the room seemed to vibrate with the friction of her hesitation. She could turn back now. She could sit in the shadows, return the portfolio to her side, and let the afternoon dissolve into another routine of compliance. The choice hung in the air, sharp and absolute. She felt the sudden, cold clarity of the moment. If she stayed, she would remain a ghost in the machine she helped build. She exhaled, releasing the tension in her shoulders, and let go of the safety of the perimeter. She took a step forward, her boot heels clicking against the hardwood with a sound that seemed too loud for the quiet room. There was no going back. With every stride, the supporting character she had been for a decade withered away, leaving only the person who would dictate the terms of the day. She reached the head of the table. The wood felt cool and solid under her fingertips. She did not take the seat immediately. She stood, anchoring herself in the space that had never been hers to occupy. The conversation at the far end of the table died out, replaced by a sudden, jagged silence. Heads turned, eyes flicked toward her, then toward each other, searching for a signal of how to handle this breach of protocol. A man near the center shifted in his chair, his brow furrowing as he scanned her face for the usual hesitation. He found none. The air in the room grew thin, charged with the static of a disrupted hierarchy. She saw them processing the change, their expressions shifting from surprise to a wary, defensive curiosity. She held her ground, letting the silence stretch until it became an uncomfortable weight for everyone but her. Every pair of eyes in the room was now fixed on her presence, no longer looking past her or through her. She was no longer a background feature of their landscape. She was the focal point. She felt the shift in gravity, a subtle tilt in the room's power dynamic that moved toward her. The space she claimed was small, but it felt immovable. She did not wait for the chair to be offered. She did not wait for the customary pleasantries that usually filled these stagnant minutes. Maya looked down at the portfolio resting on the table, her fingers tracing the edge of the material. The silence in the room was brittle, waiting for her to apologize for her intrusion, waiting for her to shrink back into the familiar pattern of the past. She ignored the expectation. She reached for the metal latch of the folder. Her movements were deliberate, slow, and precise. The metallic snap of the clasp opening was sharp, cutting through the heavy air like a glass break. It was a sound of finality. She flipped the cover back, the movement fluid and unwavering. She did not seek approval from the faces watching her. She did not scan the room for reassurance. She simply gripped the inner edge of the document stack, her knuckles firm, and prepared to reveal the work that would dismantle their assumptions. The folder lay open, exposed on the polished surface. The era of waiting for permission had ended with that single, resonant click of the latch. She was no longer asking for a seat. She was claiming the agenda. Maya slid the first sheet across the polished wood, then the second. She arranged the charts in a precise, overlapping fan, each page pinned down by the weight of months of solitary work. The numbers were dense, printed in sharp, unforgiving black ink against white paper. These were not mere estimates. They were calculated trajectories, drawn from market data they had ignored for years, right into the line of sight of the director. Her hands moved with a rhythmic, mechanical efficiency, smoothing every crease, ensuring the data was perfectly aligned. She did not speak while she worked. She let the paper do the heavy lifting. The room watched the documents spread out, tracing the lines of her projections. Every graph showed an upward trend they had previously dismissed as impossible. She pointed to a specific, highlighted cluster of figures, her finger resting steady on the page. The sheer volume of evidence began to occupy the space, displacing their doubt with hard objective reality. She stood back, her palms flat on the table, and let the sheer scale of the information anchor the room. The silence was no longer brittle. It was heavy with the weight of her findings, a wall of data they had no choice but to acknowledge. The silence in the room changed its texture. It was no longer a void waiting for her to stumble, but a vacuum pulling the room into her orbit. Chairs creaked as the attendees shifted, their posture instinctively leaning toward the center of the table. A man on her left cleared his throat, but the sound died quickly, unacknowledged. Maya watched their eyes. They moved across the graphs, hunting for an error, a flaw, a reason to dismiss the work. She saw the moment they stopped looking for mistakes and started looking for meaning. The director adjusted his glasses, his hands hovering over the documents as if he were afraid to touch them, yet unable to look away. The air in the room seemed to thin, saturated with the sudden realization that the narrative they had constructed for her was collapsing. They had expected a supporting actor, someone to provide the background noise for their decisions. Instead, they were staring at the architect of their next quarter. Someone reached out and turned a page, the sound of paper sliding against the table ringing out like a gavel. The dynamic was rewritten. The room was no longer theirs to command. It belonged to the information she had placed before them. Maya tapped the remote, and the screen behind her flickered to life. A map of current market trends filled the wall, glowing with a soft clinical blue. She stood beside the display, the light catching the edge of her silhouette. She did not raise her voice, yet every word landed with the weight of a hammer blow. She traced the jagged lines of the projected growth, explaining the intersection of consumer habits and supply chain shifts. She pointed to a drop in traditional engagement, then followed the path to the surge in emerging digital sectors. Her finger moved with precision, highlighting the specific variables they had ignored. Each data point was a brick, and she was building a fortress of logic they could not climb over. She explained the velocity of the change, showing how the market was moving faster than their current strategy could accommodate. She broke down the numbers into simple, unavoidable outcomes. She did not guess. She demonstrated. She mapped the decline of their old methods against the rise of the new demand. The screen hummed, casting a steady pulse of light over the table. She turned back to the room, her expression neutral, waiting for the logic to fully settle into their reality. The hum of the display was the only sound left in the boardroom. Maya stepped back, her hands resting firmly on the edge of the mahogany table. She gave them a moment to process the final projection. Then, the silence shattered. A man at the far end of the table scraped his chair back against the floor, the screech of metal on carpet cutting through the room. He leaned forward, his face hardening. "That is a significant leap in scale," he said, his voice clipped and sharp. "You are suggesting we abandon our primary revenue stream based on these projections?" He looked around the table, seeking an alliance in their eyes. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with the sudden friction of his skepticism. He did not look at the data. He looked at her, his gaze pointed, questioning her experience, questioning her right to propose such a radical departure. The other participants went still. The collective focus shifted from the screen to the space between them. He tapped his pen against the wood, a rhythmic, impatient sound that demanded an immediate correction. He was clearly attempting to diminish the scope of her ambition, hoping to force her back into the role of a subordinate. The challenge was direct. The room held its breath. The question hung between them, thin and sharp as a blade. The colleague waited, his chin tilted up, watching for a flicker of hesitation. He wanted her to blink. He wanted her to look down at the floor or soften her posture to regain his approval. Maya did not blink. She kept her gaze fixed on him, her hands still pressed against the mahogany. The sound of his pen tapping against the table grew louder in the void, a rhythmic, insistent pulse that measured the seconds of her silence. Around the table, the other board members shifted. A chair creaked. Someone cleared their throat, but no one spoke. The air in the room felt thick, as if the oxygen had been drained out, leaving only the pressure of the standoff. Maya held her position, her breath slow and measured, refusing to concede an inch of space. She was not a supporting actor waiting for a cue. She was the architect of the moment, and she let the silence stretch until it became an unbearable weight for everyone else in the room. Every eye was locked on her, waiting to see if she would break. The atmosphere vibrated with the tension of a wire pulled to its absolute limit. She remained perfectly still, the calm center of a brewing storm, watching the doubt flicker across his face as he realized his interruption had not worked. Maya did not shrink. She did not lower her eyes or offer a polite nod to soften the blow. Instead, she pushed off the table, her movements deliberate and slow, until she stood at her full height. She took a single step forward, narrowing the distance between her and the man who had challenged her. The ambient noise of the building, the low hum of the ventilation, the muffled city sounds seemed to drop away entirely. Her hands remained steady as she rested them on the back of the chair in front of her. She looked directly at him, her gaze locking onto his, until he was the one who shifted his eyes away. A ripple went through the room. The other board members leaned in, their skepticism replaced by a sudden, sharp realization. The balance of authority had shifted. Maya drew a breath, the sound audible in the near-total silence of the boardroom. She did not apologize for the scale of her vision. She did not offer a justification for her ambition. She simply held the space she had earned. Her posture was iron, her expression unyielding. When she finally spoke, her voice was not loud, but it was clear and resonant, cutting through the lingering tension like a blade through silk. The room went absolutely still. Maya did not wait for their confirmation. She turned, her movements fluid and purposeful, and pointed a finger directly at the jagged line of the financial projection on the screen. The light cast a glow across her face, highlighting the unwavering focus in her eyes. "The market is shifting," she said, her voice steady and clear, carrying the weight of months of research. She moved her hand, tracing the upward trajectory of the data, forcing every person in the room to track the movement with her. "And we are the ones who will define that shift." The declaration hung in the air, absolute and final. She left no room for debate, no space for the old cautious hesitation. She watched as the men at the table looked at the numbers, then at each other, their previous objections crumbling under the sheer gravity of the facts she had laid bare. The skepticism that had defined the morning evaporated. They had no ground left to stand on, no counter-argument that could withstand the momentum she had generated. She stood at the head of the table, not as a subordinate, but as the architect of their future. The room felt suddenly vast, emptied of its former noise, leaving only the sound of her own steady breathing. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy. No one broke it. Maya watched as the lead director finally reached for the thick document resting at the corner of the table. He did not look up, but his hands were deliberate as he pushed the stack of papers across the polished mahogany toward her. It was a concession, silent and absolute. Maya reached out. She took the pen, the weight of the metal familiar and cold against her skin. She did not hesitate. She placed the tip onto the signature line, feeling the slight resistance of the paper beneath the nib. The sound of the pen scratching against the page was the only noise in the entire boardroom. 1 stroke, 2, 3. With each movement, the reality of her engineered future solidified. She lifted the pen, set it down, and squared the document neatly in front of her. The ink was still wet, a dark, permanent mark on the page that signaled the end of the old order. She looked up. The director nodded once, a gesture of grudging acknowledgement. The contract was signed. The shift she had predicted was no longer a theory. It was now their reality. She closed the folder, the snap of the latch echoing like a final gavel strike. The air in the boardroom had changed. The stale, recycled oxygen of the morning was gone, replaced by a sharp, static tension. Maya stood, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. No one rushed to assist her. No one leaned forward to challenge her exit. The directors remained seated, their shoulders dropped, their gazes fixed on the document she had just finalized. The skepticism that had once anchored the room was absent, replaced by a heavy, palpable stillness. She watched as one colleague rubbed his temples, staring at the screen as if seeing the projections for the first time. The room was no longer a stage for their debate. It was a workspace for her strategy. She picked up her portfolio, the leather cool and firm under her grip. Every movement she made was precise, deliberate, and entirely unhurried. She walked toward the glass wall, looking out at the city grid. Below, the traffic flowed in organized lanes, mirroring the structure she had just imposed on the company. The weight of the change was not just in the signed papers, but in the way the space around her had folded to accommodate her direction. She turned back one last time. The room was quiet. The old order had been dismantled, and the silence was the sound of the foundation shifting into place. Maya remained in the income after the others had filed out. She stood by the table, looking down at the ink on the page. For years, she had measured her progress by the nods of others, by the approval of the board, by the slow accumulation of external milestones. Now, the paper was signed. The objective was met. Yet, as she traced the edge of the mahogany table, she realized the contract was not the source of her momentum. It was simply a mirror. She took a slow, deep breath, her chest rising and falling in the quiet room. She did not look for a witness to her success. She did not wait for a final word of validation from the empty chairs. The weight of her worth was not something to be granted by this room or the people who inhabited it. It was something she had been carrying all along, hidden behind the need to be understood. She locked her gaze on the skyline through the glass. The city lights began to flicker on, one by one, against the darkening horizon. She pushed away from the table, her movements fluid and unencumbered. The need for external permission had dissolved. She had claimed her own value, and that realization was heavier and more permanent than any document ever written. Maya stepped out of the lobby and into the cooling air of the city. The glass doors clicked shut behind her, sealing off the world she had just reshaped. A gust of evening wind swept down the corridor of skyscrapers, hitting her face with a sharp, bracing chill. She did not tighten her shoulders or hunch against the draft. She walked directly into it. The sidewalk was crowded with commuters moving in a blur of habit, heads down, eyes fixed on their screens. Maya matched her pace to the rhythm of the city but kept her eyes forward, scanning the horizon rather than the pavement. Every step felt distinct, grounded by the weight of the day and the clarity of her next move. She passed the revolving doors of the neighboring high-rises, her reflection ghosting against the dark windows. She looked at herself not as a supporting figure, but as an entity in motion. She crossed the street at the light, threading through the crowd with a precision that turned heads. She was not returning to the life she had left that morning. She was walking into a future constructed by her own hands, leaving the echoes of the boardroom behind to be swallowed by the city noise. The pavement moved beneath her boots, steady and sure. Maya reached her car and clicked the key fob. The headlights flared, casting a sharp white beam across the damp asphalt. She did not open the door immediately. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn notebook. The spine was cracked, the corners soft and frayed from years of being shoved into pockets and briefcases. She opened it to the middle. The ink on the page was faded, the handwriting hurried and desperate. These were the whispers, the goals she had once kept buried, the ideas she had been too afraid to voice aloud in a boardroom. She ran her thumb over the indentation of the letters, feeling the pressure of her younger self's ambition. The contrast was stark. Back then, these pages were her only sanctuary. Now, they were a map of a territory she had already crossed. She looked at the smudged notes, then up at the glass monolith of the office building she had just left. The scale of her recent achievements suddenly made the old, cramped handwriting seem fragile. She took a breath, the cool air filling her lungs, and held the notebook steady. The paper felt heavy, grounded in the reality of the hours she had spent refining her vision. She was no longer writing from a place of uncertainty. She was writing from a place of proof. Maya climbed into the driver's seat and pulled the door shut, locking out the city hum. The interior was dark, save for the faint glow of the dashboard lights. She rested the notebook on the steering wheel, the leather cover cool against her palms. She clicked her pen, but the tip was dry. She pressed it hard against the margin, drawing tight, aggressive circles until the ink finally bled onto the paper. It was a small, mechanical struggle, but it mirrored the road ahead. She knew the resistance would be absolute. The skepticism she faced today was only the beginning of a larger friction. She did not flinch at the thought. She positioned the pen at the bottom of the page, where the paper was clean and white. Her hand moved with rhythmic precision. She wrote not as a request, but as a statement of fact. Every letter was sharp, carved into the fiber with deliberate force. She did not hesitate to cross a word out and rewrite it, refining the phrasing until it carried the weight of her intent. When the last period was pressed into the page, she stopped. The ink was still wet, glistening under the dome light. She closed the notebook, the snap of the cover echoing in the small space. The future was no longer a set of whispers. It was recorded, bound, and ready. Maya turned the ignition. The engine hummed to life, vibrating through the steering wheel. She did not drive away immediately. She stared at the illuminated dashboard, her mind drifting to the women she mentored, the ones who currently held their ideas in silence. She pulled her phone from the passenger seat, the screen lighting up with a notification from a junior analyst she had coached for months. It was a question about navigating a difficult department head, a familiar query rooted in doubt. Maya tapped the screen, scrolling through the list of contacts. Every name represented a potential node in a larger structure. She realized her victory in the boardroom would remain an isolated incident unless she reached back to pull others through the door she had just unlocked. She tapped out a draft message, then deleted it. A text was too small for this. She needed to hear their voices. She visualized the meeting, a shared space, a transfer of strategy, a network of collective leverage. She set the phone down and gripped the wheel, her knuckles firm. She would call them all tomorrow. The strategy was no longer a solo campaign. It was an alliance. She put the car in gear and pulled out into the flow of traffic, her eyes fixed on the road, already calculating the logistics of their first meeting. Maya pulled into her driveway and killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy, clean, and entirely her own. She stepped onto the pavement, the cool air biting at her skin. She walked to the porch, her boots clicking against the concrete. She stopped at the top step, the porch light flicking on and casting a sharp, long shadow across the walkway. She looked up. The sky was clear, the stars bright and distant. She took a deep breath, feeling the tension of the day drain from her shoulders. This was the space between what she had been and what she was becoming. She reached out and touched the railing, the wood rough and solid under her fingers. It felt real. The doubt that had shadowed her for years was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady pulse of independence. She turned the key in the lock and pushed the door open. The house was dark, but she did not fumble for the switch. She knew exactly where she was standing. The seed she had planted in the silence of those early, desperate years had finally broken through the surface. It was no longer a hope or a secret. It was growing. It was here. It was hers.